Thank you for joining us today on 10 Minutes with the Artist, an episodic series that explores the art practice and the personal vision that guides artists. On today's episode, very proud to have Joshua Highley, who is completing his thesis in architecture at North Dakota State University. We invited him here today to speak about his research and the creation of artifacts in preparation for his defense. Joshua's work examines the connection between knowledge and relationships through a collection of fragments that speak to the past, communication, and creativity. His work is literally scattered into a form that gives no specific scrutiny to any element, but instead insists that viewers should seek their own order and understanding within this self-directed story. I'm Anthony Ferris, and this is 10 Minutes with the Artist. So thank you, Josh, for joining us today on 10 Minutes with the Artist. I was wondering how a tangible object like a piece of paper or a piece of art is different than something that exists in the digital sphere.
I think that's a good question. The art actually dealt with both. The artifact itself, it was recorded letters, which were physical, and then I reproduced them over and over. I kept printing and allowing the machine to kind of take over and do what it does best and do what it does worst, and just to kind of see what would happen to each letter over time. So I would say that the digital letter, I mean, that's great. So that exists, and that's reproducible, and that's something that can have a very far reach. But once it becomes physical, it becomes very intimate, I think. And so while I got these letters from an online collection, and I'm sure hundreds of people have kind of sifted through them, once I printed them, they became something a lot more intimate. And so it actually kind of, the process of the artifact actually took these once very intimate objects, which had become very public, and made them a little more intimate in a completely different room.
So how does knowledge exist or interact in your piece?
That's a good question. I think the whole artifact exploration was me trying to answer that. And I would say that most people are probably doing that, but my architectural program specifically lent itself well for this. So knowledge, it was kind of all about how things can recombine and come back together after being fragmented, split, scattered, and literally thrown across a room. And I think a lot of our kind of embodied knowledge, or a lot of the knowledge we had within ourselves, actually came to bear on what was happening in the performance. And so sometimes we would have these scattered things, and they would become very interesting because one person would read part of a letter, and then one person across the room would read another part of the letter, and there would be a connection, and people would say, oh, that's kind of cool, because those sentences connected. And sometimes it was just because they happened to make sense, but sometimes it was because we knew about contexts, especially me, because I'm so familiar with the letters, but we would hear these contexts kind of converging. And so knowledge, just kind of again on a very intimate level, knowledge had a kind of a voltaic spark. I mean, it connected from across the room to create something new. But overall, I would say knowledge, what it did was it brought something, again, something very intimate from somebody's personal history, but it brought to bear something totally new on the site of Renaissance Hall, but also on the site of the architectural project. And it kind of related an entire plot of land in downtown St. Paul to something much bigger throughout history. So now, I mean, I think knowledge does a whole breadth of things. In the artifact, this is kind of what it dealt with.
Well, you have this really nice line that I'd like to read, which says that through recitation, the fragments pull together into something less defined, but potentially more directed. And how did that reveal itself?
Immediately, it kind of revealed itself just by these kind of strings of letters. So these letters, again, were spliced and split. And once they were reconnected, there was just a full table or a full pool, if you will, of these elements that kind of just happened to come together in that way. And so it was almost not defined. There was the surface of the table, but it was basically that and the letters. And so while it was kind of undefined in that sense, people were able to take new directions with each different segment and kind of see things from across the table. And so it was again taking some of that embodied knowledge and history that we have and bringing it into the context, and it was kind of giving new directions for people to actually interpret some of the stuff that they might not necessarily be familiar with, but they were able to find these things and move forward with new meanings and maybe even new understandings of people they've heard of in history, or maybe they haven't heard of in history.
So why did this format seem to be the best way to convey this for you? Because I'm thinking that like knowledge sometimes, but not always, is conveyed in like books or in a very specific way, and you relied on this this idea of like existing on the ground or being stacked. And so how did that format sort of work with your premise?
Well, the format, it kind of took shape naturally. A lot of us were working together. I was very fortunate to have classmates who were very interested in kind of the content and participating. And so there's just something about a large collection of things, whether it's I think we see it in books. People love to see if they can rip a phone book. They love to tear things apart. And so having this collection and having an empty room was just, I think it was just a happy coincidence, and people started throwing. But what happened was we found that those letters had a way of kind of getting back into our hands, whether it was somebody saw something they liked and they picked it up, or maybe I just said, hey, grab something really quick, let's see what happens if we read these things aloud. So the format, I thought was very, very relatable. It was something that all of us, I think everyone uses paper on a daily basis. And while we might not write letters all the time, now we're maybe texting or emailing, we're still very kind of familiar with correspondence. So the format in that sense I thought was very, very interesting to work with, because it was almost mundane, if you will. The letters were very important to the people who wrote it, but just these physical objects were so mundane, they're so regular, that they lended something very interesting to the display and to the activity of reading overall.
Okay. At the end of the conversation, we like to talk a little bit about your creative practice. So I was curious what time of day you feel like you're most creative.
I have tried to figure that out for many years, and it always seems to differ. Sometimes it feels like it's late at night, but I never know, because I'm wondering if it's just towards the end of a deadline, if you know what I mean. But there are times when I'm very productive and I come up with a lot of very interesting ideas in the morning. When I've had a good breakfast, or maybe it's just because the building's empty and I'm just kind of on my own with a nice little bit of sunlight coming in, just kind of at my desk working on my own. I think there's something about the mornings that has started to call to me more and more. So I'm trying to get better at waking up.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything that you're reading right now?
I'm reading a couple things. I have a copy of the Federalist Papers, but that's kind of an undertaking. I kind of became interested in politics in the past couple years, and especially after this fall, it's become a lot more interesting. So I kind of wanted to explore some of those very early writings from our country. I'm also reading this book called Mobile, which is a French poet wrote about the United States and some topics that he found interesting.
And what did you find was the most challenging thing about working in your medium?
Well, it was challenging to just kind of let some of those things loose, because there was just a kind of a large body of things to work with. Actually getting it out and into people's hands or into people's ears, maybe they're people passing by, just kind of unlocking a lot of these things, which are very interesting, and they all kind of tell a story, and doing it quickly. There was a time when I had a lot of these things pinned up on corkboards, and I would see people looking at them, and maybe it would take them 10 minutes to look at them, and they'd tell me that it was very interesting. But doing it in a very succinct way, with direction and with some kind of particular methods for allowing people to explore the specific stories in the work, that was probably the biggest challenge.
Okay. And then I guess my last question would be, what's next for you?
I would like to relax. Graduation's coming up. I'm finally going to drive east. I'm going to help a friend get back to Ohio. So just driving across that part of the country that I've never been in, that is the immediate next thing coming up.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so very much for joining us today. And I'd like to thank you all for your time and your interest in the professional practices and the creative explorations happening here at North Dakota State University. So thank you. And for everyone here at the Memorial Union Gallery, keep creative.